our channel. Together, we set out to read and explore great works of literature.
While dressed in elegant clothing, because why the hell not?
Okay, wonderful. So today we decided we'd take up two novellas. The first one here is The Alienist by Machado de Assis, and the second one we'll be taking on would be The Duel by Giacomo Casanova. They're both from the same publisher. In fact, one thing I wanted to mention at the get-go was that this particular collection, whoever decided to compile this collection of novellas, is particularly obsessed with dueling because there are 5 instances of short stories that are actually entitled The Duel. So we'll take this one in turn. I think the first one will start off with The Alienist. Did you want to give a biographical note on the author slide?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll start off. So Machado de Assis, I believe he was born in, let me just double check here because I don't have my notes prepared.
1882.
Okay, in 1882. He's a Brazilian writer. He's actually, I've been hearing quite a bit in the reading community online. His name has been traveling around recently. I've read this quite a while ago, and only recently we just decided to reread it. But he's Latin America's most famous writer. I would say Jorge Luis Borges is also up there, but Machado de Assis, even though he isn't published very often, actually quite rarely, he does have quite a bit of fame back home.
And published, you mean by published in English? So he's rarely translated?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for that point. Yeah. So a little bit about him. So he was of mixed race, and his parents were a wall painter, and his father was a wall painter, and his mother was a washerwoman. And he was discovered at the age of 15 by, I believe he was a bookseller or
a
publisher.
Or something like that.
Something of that sort. But he ended up publishing his first poem at the age of 15. So he was a bit of a prodigy, I suppose.
And then married into wealth, which was apparently the wife's family did not agree with that.
Yeah.
But he managed to woo her and win her over.
Yeah, and I think it's quite tragic because did he die of a broken heart?
Yes, so his wife passed away, and then it's claimed that he was depressed and shortly passed away after that.
Yeah.
So, although his book isn't very romantic, apparently he was a romancer.
And it's a bit of a satire, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess just to give a little bit of a background of the story without giving too much of the plot away. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the term alienist. It's sort of an old-fashioned term for a psychiatrist or maybe even a psychologist. But someone who is a medical doctor but studies the mind. And so this is the story is about a world famous Brazilian alienist who decides to go back to his hometown after getting world recognition and fame for his wonderful practice and his wonderful erudition.
As a physician.
Right, as a physician. And so he decides that he's going to set up shop in his hometown. And he's very much interested in psychiatry and sort of the mind, and he has a particular fixation on this idea of madness and mental illness. And of course, he wants to also make a bit of a name for himself, but I think his motivations are purely, he is selfless in a way. Like, he does want to, like, it's always in the sort of the name of science. I think he's always trying to push
kind
that.
of, but it was also, I think it was, at that time, psychoanalysis hadn't been widely practiced, so it was this like sense of for science, but also the novelty of it, I think.
Yeah, perhaps there's an element of the ego there as well.
Yeah.
So anyway, so he ends up coming up with all these different theories about the nature of mental illness and the nature of insanity and what does it mean to be normal and what does it mean to be abnormal, and all these different hilarious scenes ensue. And he actually ends up sparking a revolution, accidentally, of course. And just the outcome of the revolution is quite comic and rather satirical in itself. And the ending is wonderfully logical and paradoxical at the same time. And I think this was unbelievably executed, this story.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me, what was your favorite scene?
Okay, so my favorite scene was the when he ends up committing his own wife. which, to be fair, he claims that it wasn't out of like a lust relationship or even a love relationship for that matter. He was very calculated, so that just shows an introduction to the character too, where he was very objective and calculated, very true to the scientific method in how he found a wife. So she was very much in love with him, it sounded like, but anyway, it was a funny thing where he what we would see very typically even in today's society of people like liking their jewelry, liking their clothes, and only really talking about that. And the physician,
over it,
yeah,
right?
The physician sees that as he claims it to be some sort of like object fixation or yeah, and so he ends up committing his own wife. So I thought that was pretty funny.
I pretty much laughed. I think we both laughed out loud. I think that was one of the most humorous parts. There's a lot of funny parts in this novella, but I would say that was the best part of it.
What did you think of it overall?
I really enjoyed this book. I think it was, like I said earlier, perfectly executed, and I think the way he plays with logic and the way he plays with rationality, I find they're very incisive and very cutting, and it was almost threaded very beautifully. So in the end, it's not as you expect, but it is as you expect. So it's kind of a paradoxical outcome of the story. And I really enjoyed that. And there was another element there I found very interesting, a theme that emerges. And when the alienist is going around sort of his small village and seeing all these people with their own human faults and failings, one guy, I think he ends up giving away all of his money without any sense of, wanting it returned or any interest compounded with what he's loaning out. He ends up being committed in a sense he actually ends up being committed to the asylum.
Or the other guy who's like he came from humble status and then worked really, really hard to save his money so that he could buy this beautiful house upon retirement. So he buys the most grandiose house in all of the town. It was Uruguay, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Something like that.
And then all he does is he stands outside of his house and just stares at his beautiful house that has beautiful furniture and just adores it and feels great satisfaction from what he's done. He was committed for having an obsession with his home and and only standing and watching and looking at his home.
And so it's like all these perfectly human failings, and he sees that as signs of pathology. Mental pathology, and it's really amusing, and in a sense it's a biting satire, biting critique of what we would understand as normality. Like, what does it mean to be psychologically normal? And it kind of shows that for the most part people act irrationally, and that there is and paradoxically what it does show is that the people who are most rational, they live their lives purely based on reason and empirical logical calculation and empiricism. They end up being the most irrational and the most destructive in many ways members of the society. So I found that very subversive, but very interesting.
And I'm sure med students can probably empathize with this, where you start to learn about only pathology and that's all you see is pathology.
It's the medical student syndrome, you said.
But then it's not just about that. So that's humorous in its own sense, but I think if it just were to stay only talking about that, the novel would become quite dull. So I liked that it was about the alienist himself, his kind of faults and shortcomings by being so objective, but then there was even more to that story. Maybe you want to touch on the other element that it also... It
ended up falling apart in a sense into revolution.
Yeah.
That's the part you're referring to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it also, funny enough, shows how this revolt against the alienist, who's very well connected with the government, how it escalates into this sort of violent confrontation with the people who are now terrified of the alienist and his power and his ability to throw people into the greenhouse, which is the name of the asylum. And interestingly enough, you see the revolution take place, and then it starts to fracture and it starts to segment, and then one revolutionary is deposed by another revolutionary, and it becomes quite a mess. And it's funny how, in a sense, something that can come out quite reasonably and with a justified cause for outrage ends up devolving into people who are just power hungry.
Yeah.
You know, and for self-interest and...
Yeah, and then the person who's really at fault for all these issues kind of leaves unscathed.
Yeah.
In a sense. And all the other events that happen, all the people get kind of lost in that, or even how fear can dictate how we respond to things, you know, like the supposed best friend of the alienist quickly becomes unloyal, but then his unloyalty ends up giving him another form of penalty. So either way, it's like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, in multiple different scenes with multiple different characters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me just give you a little picture here. So this series here is the Melville House. They call these hybrid books. They're all novellas, and I think there's quite a number of them in the collection. They're very quick reads. Obviously, their own novella is going to dictate a very small number of pages here. They're not particularly much. They're not much to look at. I mean, it's just a very plain background with plain lettering bolded on it. So let's move on to the second
I think the point that I just made is kind of a good overall with the Duel, because it's a good segue, because with the Duel that was the only trend I can really see between the two, is that
what was that?
The sense of like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
Oh, interesting.
Like that's the only thing I could kind of, there's no real, other than they're both in a sense a satire, they're very different books, so
very different.
But yeah, in a sense it's like, even the best intentions in this one, in The Alienist, the best intentions can have very harmful effects, right? And this one, maybe not the best intentions, can have both harmful and benefits.
Almost like no intentions, no real intentions.
Can end up harmful too.
Yeah. So obviously many of you have probably heard of Casanova. And I think there was I don't know if you call it campy, but there was a movie with Heath Ledger who played Casanova. And I'm not sure how true to life that story was. Probably not, but don't quote me, I haven't seen it. But Casanova was born in Venice in 1725, and he was actually considered he's still considered one of the world's most famous libertines. So he was very well known for his womanizing, his gambling, his fighting in duels. What else?
Yeah, you already said womanizing. I think like that's the most.
Yeah, he's a notorious colorful character, let's say, and this one is in a sense a little bit of an adventure story.
Like Casanova himself, right? Because Casanova was also a spy.
He was a spy as well, right? Yeah.
And he was quite.
He was a musician. He played the violin.
So things I didn't know about Casanova before reading this. Yeah. And also he was quite a smart.
He was a prodigy.
Prodigy, which I didn't know. Yeah. So it's funny how you kind of just only hear Casanova and you think womanizer and kind of male ego, right?
Yeah.
There's more. He was what age did he graduated law school?
He graduated law school, and then I think at 16.
16, yeah.
And then he joined a seminary, and then got promptly kicked out.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And so it's a veiled autobiographical, it's a faintly veiled autobiography that he wrote, of course. That's very redundant. Obviously, it's an autobiography. So it's actually, I found this one very interesting, more in the sense of the historical aspects of it. Apparently the accuracy in terms of the ritual. Duels are very ritualized affairs. And it's very interesting to see the mentality of people at the time. This would have been in the 18th century, mid-18th century, if not a little bit earlier, surrounding that sense of honor and the sense of decorum. And I'm of two minds about it. Ava might have a different perspective on it, but I'm of two minds. I actually find on one side there is sense to be a generosity of spirit. There is a sense of decorum, nicety, a certain ritualized behavior that two people can become blood brothers in a sense through undergoing this bizarre arguably stupid action. And, it speaks to a completely different society, completely different moral code, where honor was something to be defended at all costs above your own life. So I think, of course, many of those things are outdated, but I think there's a lot of civility attached to it and a lot of, I guess, military honor attached to it.
Yeah, it's in military honor.
Yeah, and like certain virtues that come about from a sort of a military, upright, proud spirit. And I can see how much of it can be misplaced, ego, I'm sure Eva would say.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I wanted to mention was there's this famous trilogy. Actually, it's famous, but it's not well known, I would say, in North America. And this is by the Hungarian author Miklos Banfi, and it's called the Transylvanian Trilogy. And it's set, 100 years later in like the late 19th century, but there was this very comic scene where he ends up accidentally brushing up against a drunken fellow at a party, and all the other men around the room insist that this was done maliciously and purposely, and the drunken guy doesn't even remember what happened, whether he even was pushed or he fell on his own, and the main character was insistent that the guy bumped into him. And so it ends up being this, through miscommunication and through all this intrigues, through all of the other members who witnessed this act, they end up forcing them into having a duel. And when it finally comes down to the duel, neither of them know actually what the actual offense was. So it ends
I feel like I enjoyed that more than maybe the plot of this one.
But in a sense, there was
Similar,
there was an element in that too, where although I think his opponent, the Venetian's opponent in this one was
persistent.
He was more persistent. He had more of that braggadocio and that sense of like machismo.
Yeah,
like he was a Polish count, I believe, something of that nature. And but yeah, I found that rather humorous to observe the sort of parallels between those two. That it ends up being the seconds or the people who are surrounding these two principals, who would be the first duelists.
Yeah.
That it would encourage the actual act to its conclusion.
I always think of a duel of like a real protection of pride and of your loved one, and the humor in this is that, I mean, Casanova being Casanova in this character, it's, I don't forget what his name is, but anyway, he obviously didn't really Venetian, Venetian, which is obviously a Casanova. Didn't really even care for the woman who he was defending.
It was a ballerina.
Yeah, but he had two ballerinas. But, like,
he was rather indifferent.
Very indifferent about them, but yet he felt like he had to go through with the procedures of this. I don't know. I didn't find it that.
Well, I found
entertaining.
What was very ironic at the end was that despite all of the trouble he went through and being injured and injuring someone else and almost having a lot of health issues, let's say dire health issues as a result of the duel, he still couldn't escape from public infamy and slander. And what's interesting is, as much as it comes across as a very superficial sounding novel and, self-promotion and extravagance and all these different sort of things that you can throw at Giacomo here, what I found very interesting is that he also puts nice pieces of wisdom, actually things that are quite relevant to us today and any other day, is that he does say that the main character didn't have enough wisdom at that time of his life.
Quote. That's true. I like
to realize that no matter who slanders you or why they slander you or how they slander you, cannot force down the truth of the matter down someone's throat.
Yeah, I think it was something along the lines of like a wise person would just remain silent despite what other people, and not feel the need to convince others.
Let them think what they're going to think.
Let them, in short,
Yeah, and I found that scattered throughout, there's a lot of interesting quotes, and he does quote a lot of authors from antiquity like Plato and Cicero, and there's some interesting things to be gleaned from that, and I think that could profit anyone at any age in any time period. So even though it comes across as a very decorous and very flamboyant sort of characterization of his life, there's something that's valuable to be taken from it as well.
I think what I also found funny was that really the only reason why he even engaged in this was the honor of the other man that he was having the duel with. He's like, I can't not have a duel. This will be a dishonor to him, that his emotions were unjustified. So I have to do this in order for him to also have honor. And so he enters it for that reason, not so much for protection of not only himself, but also of this other person. Right. And then in the end, the person ends up earning his respect from entering that duel, but then the rest of the world, which I probably would have been part of that, was very, I guess, shaming of his actions.
But what's interesting to also add to that point is that, to keep in mind that this is all set primarily in Imperial Poland. And at the time, even at the time in this early 18th century, mid 18th century, it was outlawed. Dueling was considered outlawed. So they actually had to, in order to complete the duel, they actually had to leave the jurisdiction in order for it to take place. Otherwise, ironically enough, the penalty for dueling is to be executed. So it doesn't leave you very much hope for continuing your life after some sort of dreadful encounter like this. I should also mention, I know this is just a book review, but there are, I think, two movies that come to mind that I find capture dueling very interesting. And the first one is, of course, called The Duelists, which is, interesting enough, it's actually the best portrayal of 18th century dueling out there.
Was that the one I saw with you?
No, we haven't seen that one together. But it was actually based on a true story of two officers, one of higher rank, that would actually be dueling one another over 20 years. That they never completed their duels, so they would duel each other countless times over 20-something years. And the other one was the one we saw together with Stanley Kubrick, Barry Lyndon. Yeah. And there's some really, really intense scenes. You didn't enjoy that film?
I think that's maybe what...
I found that film.
So far, everything I've read about dueling, please tell me if you find anything that really is captivating with dueling. I don't know if I just have a real prejudice against this, male ego type of activity. I don't know, but I just can't seem to find it redeeming. Yeah.
But Barry Lyndon was a fantastic film, regardless of the dueling. Okay. There wasn't much dueling in it, but there was a couple scenes. Scenery-wise, okay. Oh, it was... Yeah. The story
for me, it was like, if I just muted everything, I would have enjoyed it just as much as I unmuted it.
It was gorgeous. Anyway, this is not about movies. This is not a movie and film review. But anyway, so what would you rate this one?
Well, why don't we start with The Alienist?
Okay, yeah, let's start with that one.
The Alien. I'll give it to you.
The Alien or the
Alienist?
The Alienist. I'd give this one 4.5 out of 5.
Okay, this time I'm doing lower. I'm gonna give it a 4.
Okay.
I found it funny, but yeah. Okay.
Okay, and then the next one.
Do you want to do this?
What would you rate this one?
Okay. 3.
3. I would give it 3.5, just because I enjoy history, and I also I'm a bit of a romantic when it comes to these things.
That romantic.
No, not romantic in the sense of love. Romantic and
it had a lot of details about how you even duel, like cleaning the gun and
but like
what the wounds look like afterwards.
There's something,
and it's like, okay, this is taking the romance out. Like if you want to learn about a duel,
poetic. It's like a poetic thing, but foolish, but poetic at the same time. So I would give it 3.5.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. We did a reversal where you did that.
Last time she gave only.
Okay, we don't have anything to cheer, so what do we do?
High five. Okay. If you've ever participated in a duel,
or you've ever misdiagnosed someone,
clinically misdiagnosed someone.
Actually, you probably don't want to admit that, so let's take that back.
Well, if you decide to admit that, you can actually leave that in the comments below, and you can subscribe as well, or like our video. That would be really appreciated.
Have a great and elegant evening, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.